Good afternoon, and thank you for joining tonight's web seminar featuring Dr. Jackie Marsh. It is nice to see returning GCLR participants, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. We hope you will continue participating in future web seminars. Your moderators for this evening are Dr. Peggy Albers, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia, USA, and me, Ryan Boylan, Language and Literacy doctoral student at Georgia State University. We also have a research team of doctoral students from Georgia State University and a doctoral student from the University of Pennsylvania. Global Conversations in Literacy Research consists of online interactive web seminars with the intent to circulate cutting-edge research in the fields of literacy and language arts. GCLR, as a research project, seeks volunteers for our study of critical literacy professional development in online spaces. If you are willing to participate in a brief interview, please type your email address into the chat area and a research team member will contact you within a few days to schedule an appointment. We also invite you to take our survey. The hyperlink is located on the GCLR website. The data collected will provide important information for understanding our research regarding web seminars and their impact on international literacy discussions. During tonight's web seminar, if you have any comments or questions, please type them into the chat box, and Dr. Marsh will address these at the end of her presentation. We would love to know from where you are participating in tonight's web seminar, so please use the star tool located to the immediate left of this slide and click your location on the map. Dr. Jackie Marsh is a professor of education at the University of Sheffield in England. Dr. Marsh's research focused on the relationship between childhood cultures, play, and literacy in the digital age. She explores children's access to new technologies and their emergent digital literacy skills, knowledge, and understanding, and the way in which parents, carers, and other family members support this engagement with media and technologies. In her more recent research, Dr. Marsh has explored changes in children's play due to developments in media, technology, and commercial cultures. She is the author of a number of books that address young children, play, and digital literacy, including Changing Play, Play, Media, and Commercial Culture from the 1950s to the present day, Children's Virtual Play Worlds, Culture, Learning, and Participation, and Children, Media, and Playground Cultures, Ethnographic Studies, and of school playtime. Tonight's seminar draws on data from a number of studies of young children's aged birth to 8 literacy lives in the United Kingdom in order to consider the nature of their online literacy practices over the past decade and to examine some of their current practices. At this time, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jackie Marsh and her presentation entitled Young Children's Online Practices, Past, Present, and Future.
Hi. Okay, so can you hear me okay, yeah? So thank you very much for inviting me. I'd like to thank Peggy very much for inviting me to present to you today, and I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to participate. I will explain. I'm on a very small laptop, so I'll have to put my glasses on later to see what you're writing in the chat forum. So what I want to do today is reflect on the changing nature of young children's online practices as we move ever more steadily into the digital age, and I want to contrast children's play, literacy, and media practices in the past. I want to go a little bit past the beginning use of the internet to the 1950s, because that relates to some recent work that I've done. But then look over the past decade in particular to children's early years in internet use, and then thinking about the online practices that children today are engaged. And then at the end of the presentation, just want to look ahead to think about what some of the challenges that might face those of us who are trying to understand this area. What will those challenges be for us? So that's the aim of the presentation. So if I move on to the next slide.
Yeah, just hit that little right button there, Jackie. There.
Oh, yes, there.
It's just right.
Okay. Yes,
there you go.
Sorry. Okay, so it's a little unusual in that I am drawing on a number of studies and not just one study. So forgive me if it's, there's breadth rather than depth, but I just wanted to take this overview. And I'm going back to a study that I did in 2005 now, a national study of over 1,800 families, children aged 0 to 6 in the UK, called the Digital Beginning Study. I'm also going to draw on a paper that I've recently written, looking at the audience reception to the Disney film, Davy Crockett, which was released in the 1950s, and contrast that with the audience reception to Frozen, which was released very recently. And that draws on some secondary data from the corpus material of Iona and Peter Opie, who were folklorists in the UK. So then moving on to the present, I'm going to draw from a recent study. We've only just published this report, and I was a member of a UK team along with Sonia Livingston and Lydia Plowman in England, and we looked at 10 families and young children aged 6 and 7, their use of a range of digital technologies. And that was 6 countries plus Russia, so very interesting to look at the similarities across European children's use of technologies. And then I also want to draw on a recent case study of a young boy starting school in England. This is part of Anne Dyson is developing a book where we all, across I think 6 or 7 countries, we have to contribute a case study of a young child starting school from our different countries. And so I chose Gareth, who was 4 and a half, and I traced his online practices from home to school over the course of 3 months. So I'll talk a little bit about Gareth, because I think what he's doing is very interesting in relation to some of the new phenomena that we're seeing young children engage in, certainly within the UK. And then finally, I want to talk about a project that's going to begin in April 2015 that I want to invite you all to participate in if you wish to. So I'm going to look across all of these projects and try and bring out some of the key themes that informs this historical analysis of children's online practices. So I have posted the links. I've given Peggy the links to all of the papers, which are all online and accessible if you want to follow up afterwards. So I'm not going to talk in great detail about the theoretical background to these studies that is embedded in the papers, but obviously I draw on new literacy studies because first and foremost that identifies the way in which literacy is a social practice. Then also I draw on work emerging from the field of new literacies such as Lancashire and Noble's work, and then more recent work in that field that has drawn on the term digital literacies, which obviously refers to digital meaning making, reading, writing, multimodal authoring on screens of all kinds. And then drawing on a theory of multimodality to look at the range of modes and media young children are engaged in. Obviously also draw on the work of a range of people, James and so on, in childhood cultures, but in the more recent studies looking at child law, so that is the childhood practices that are transmitted orally and multimodally in playgrounds and streets. So that's been informing some of my recent work, thinking about the continuities and discontinuities in play and literacy over time. And then finally, cultural and material studies and media studies are also important in understanding this relationship of children's practices across a range of media. And in particular, the work of Raymond Williams, who talks about the way in which culture is ordinary. And that's been a key theme of my work right from the beginning, that we need to attend to the ordinary popular cultural interests of children, because that's where a lot of our knowledge lies around children's competencies across a range of media. So sorry, let me just move on. So I want to start with thinking about the past. From the Digital Beginning Study, which was 10 years ago now in the UK, less than a third of children were accessing the internet at that point, and they were mainly doing it alongside their adult carers. Children were demonstrating independence in the use of access at that time. So, for example, parents would say things like, well, my child can't read, but he can actually shut down everything competently. Children could go on to the web browser and locate favourite programs by recognising the relevant logos, so their logographic knowledge was helping them to navigate the internet. And the kinds of practices that they engaged in were primarily related to gaming, particularly oriented to their interests in television, CBeebies, Nickelodeon, and so on, and their popular cultural interests. And as you can see there, very few children participating in communication through emails or mobile phones. So this could be seen as very early days of internet use for this age group. I don't have the figures here for international figures, but I know from the work of Rideout and so on, we can see this similar pattern in the US. So they were the early days. Moving on to the sort of looking at the present, obviously we can see that even before they're born today, now children are digitally traced. In the UK, we see the rising popularity of 3D photographs of fetuses. I don't know about you, but I always think these are a little bit creepy. And then, once they're born, children moving on to, have their every move often documented on social media, such as WhatsApp, Facebook, and so on. So they're already, before they're born, and then in the very early stages of life, embedded in this technological world. Thinking about young children's own uses, in the UK, these are figures from our recent government survey, our Ofcom survey. We can see now that although it was less than a third 10 years ago, now 69% of 5 to 7-year-olds are going online regularly, and almost 40% of 3 to 4-year-olds accessing the internet from home. There's still a lot of children who are not accessing the internet from home, so we do have to be mindful of what opportunities early years settings are providing for those children who don't have those facilities at home. And of course, like other countries, we're seeing the increasing interest in the use of the tablet because of the affordances of the tablets for young children. So those figures are doubling year after year. And again, I know that Common Sense Media's study in the US, for example, noted the app gap between children from high socioeconomic families and low socioeconomic families. And we find that gap here in the UK also, often with children from low socioeconomic areas having the plastic replicas, the leap pads and so on, which don't have the expensive affordances of the tablets, iPads and Android tablets. So in the EU study, we looked at 70 families across Europe, and gaming is still the most prevalent online activity of young children. That's not changed over the last 10 years. But the kinds of games that children are playing have changed. Some of the younger children are still attracted to those CBeebies, those broadcasting online sites, and playing the sort of games that they provide. But many children, as they move to 4 and 5, are orientated to the kinds of games that they can see their older siblings and parents playing, such as Angry Birds. And I think that's because of the way that the apps, which are now placed on the tablet, make those kinds of games, much more accessible to children than they used to be pre-tablet era. We also found in the EU study that across all of those 6 countries plus Russia, YouTube was the primary site that young children of this age group used. Again, that's probably no surprise to many of you, and that they were watching music videos, cartoons and so on, but also quite eclectic interests that were related to often, family interests that were pretty particular to those families. So the other thing that we found in the European study was that children's viewing of more traditional media, such as television, is rapidly changing. So with the provision of catch-up features where parents and children can go online and find programs that were on previously, children can catch up. They're no longer, live broadcast is still quite popular, but they like to repeat their viewing using these catch-ups. And obviously with mobile technologies now, they're able to watch on the move. The other thing that we're finding is, we found is increased personalization. So some of the young people that we looked at had YouTube channels where they were favorited their videos. And so as Potter has shown us, children from a very young age being able to curate their digital interests through the personalization possible through the use of tablets. So moving on then to think about, what are some of the discontinuities in relation to young children's online practices. You can see here, this is where I move on to Davy Crockett. So in the paper that I've written about that, I discussed the audience reception of Davy Crockett in the 1950s and point to the way in which, as the Opie noted, parodic verses that were developed in relation to the Davy Crockett film were passed between children very quickly and circulated across countries over a period of weeks. So rhymes that were found in English playgrounds were very soon found in Australian playgrounds. And the Opies suggested that that was an example of trans-world couriers employed by the school child underground, as they put it. So we can compare that spread of interest now to the affordances of contemporary media, where synchronous, rapid communication via the YouTube, we can see a much quicker spread of knowledge. So contrasting that with Frozen, we can see here Emily and Izzy's dance routine very quickly picked up, rapidly then adopted in playgrounds, across many countries. So that synchronous and asynchronous communication via Twitter, Facebook, YouTube enables games and rhymes to be passed on rapidly. And Julia Bishop, a researcher who worked with me on a previous project on playground play, also noted that in relation to the transmission of clapping games. And you may be familiar with the cup game, which again, we've seen rapid transmission through YouTube. So we can characterize that as a viral playground in which cultural knowledge and memes get passed on very quickly in this online world. So moving on then to think about other changes. Of course, some things don't change. So this sort of brandscape that we can see in children's lives is nothing new. So here in the 1950s, we can see with Davy Crockett that over 3,000 items were produced and marketed in relation to that film. So that's not much different from the kinds of narrative structures we see in children's play today. What's different, obviously, is the way in which media and online media play an important part in children's mediascape. So drawing from Akaguri, that notion of mediascapes. So these are the media artifacts and narratives that inform children's imaginary in the digital age. So this is Gareth, the child who I told you about. I undertook a case study of Gareth over 3 months, and Lego was one of his main interests, as can be seen here. But as was the case with Davy Crockett, Gareth was able to own a range of toys and artifacts that related to his interests. But what was interesting was the way in which children's orientation to these toys had changed over time. So I'm going to draw from the work of Sharvad here, who did an analysis of Lego. And Lego is really interesting because it is one of the main companies that have kept up with some of the changes through looking at what children are doing and adopting some of those practices. So he talks about these three concepts in relation to Lego. They've been successful over the past few years of what he calls imaginarization, so linking Lego to fantasy worlds, narrativization, so extending Lego into magazines and computer games and developing stories around some of the minifigures and characters, and then visualization, so replication of Lego's physical bricks on computer screens, which obviously leads children then to use them in a range of online platforms. So in the work that myself and Julia did in analysing...
Jackie?
Hello? Sorry? Yeah. So, can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, sorry, Jackie. I'm not sure that you're... Yes, but I don't know if your slides are advancing.
Oh, sorry. They are on my screen. So I'm up to slide...
Okay, so I'm not sure that they're advancing. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that the slides were advancing. I'm not sure that they're advancing on our side as much. We can get a confirmation from the audience. Are the slides advancing for you?
No. Oh. I don't. Yeah. Oh dear. Sorry. Oh.
So sorry about that. I'm sorry about that too. I just wanted to make sure that we weren't having any technical difficulties on our end. So we might have to just have you just say advance, and we can maybe advance it for you, Jackie. I'm really sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. So I can see that in the chat, people are saying that the ultrasound image is on now, and well, that is quite an early slide in the talk. So I don't know if any of the moderators are able to advance the slides for me at all, because I'm on one now, slide 24, I think it is. It's got Marsh and Bishop at the top.
Yes, we'll go ahead and do that for you, Jackie. We're sorry about that.
No problem, thank you. So I'll just say next slide then, shall I, when we're ready to move on? Yeah, okay. So I apologise. I've been rushing through and probably, not anticipating this, so apologies. So I just talked about Harvard's notions of imaginarization, narrativization and visualization in relation to Lego to show how they've kept up with some of the immediate changes in young children's lives. So when Julia and I were looking at this in relation to our previous study, we thought we would like to add, 3 different concepts that would help us to understand what Lego are doing to move forward into, the next stage of online life. So first we can see participation. So they actually, children produce Lego films using Lego characters and then uploading them to YouTube. That then promotes socialization as children then engage in discussions around that, and then mobilization. So Lego themselves have developed apps such as Lego Creationary, which allows children to make Lego models online and on tablets and smartphones and so on. So through this way, Lego are, keeping up to date with some of these changes. And Gareth, in my case study, was very much a part of, this Lego affinity space, drawing from G's notion of affinity space. So if we can move on, please, to the next slide, which should be a photograph of an app on the screen. It's the YouTube app. So this Gareth, on his YouTube channel, had a range of things related to Lego, both that were made by other children and that were produced by Lego themselves. I'll come to some of these questions later on, if that's okay. So if we move on to the next slide. Here we can see Lego Fusion. I don't know if you've seen that yet. It's only been launched in the States. We don't yet have it in the UK. But this is where Lego have actually developed some augmented reality apps. This allows the child to make a model with the Lego bricks, upload it onto the app screen, and then play with it virtually. So these are spaces that blend online, offline, and in these affinity spaces, children are participating in collaborative activities. We move on to the next slide. Just to show you very quickly, this is just to give you some idea of the complexities of children's online and offline relationships in the UK, certainly. This is a sociograph of a class of 6 and 7-year-olds from one school in Sheffield, largely a working class area. And the children were asked to draw a black line to someone that they played with offline and a red line to someone they played with online. So this was really interesting to me. We did this across all of the classes, and we found a number of things. So obviously, if you begin to analyse some of these friendship patterns, they are very interesting. Children are playing online with children that they're playing with offline. That's certainly the case. But there are new friendship groups developing, and particularly, cross-gender, so children more willing to play with children of the other gender if it's online. I won't talk about that, but it was interesting, and I did interview children at either end of the spectrum who were hardly online and those who had a lot of online friends, just to sort of identify the differences and similarities in their experiences across different spaces. But that's just to give you some idea of how children, certainly in England, now have very complex online and offline lives. I know that there's been sort of much discussion in this area, and some people say that we should no longer distinguish between online and offline. I still like to keep the distinction because I do think there are some ontological differences between online and offline, and certainly issues in relation to modality, which I think are really interesting to look at. And so for me, that distinction still stands, although obviously drawing on Kevin Leander's work and so on, we can see that the blending and merging of practices across those spaces. So it's certainly, the boundary is very, very, very fuzzy. So moving on then, I want to talk about some of the other practices that I saw Gareth engage in. I've put a link to a paper where I talk in more depth at this. And one of the affinity space activities was this phenomenon unboxing. So Gareth loved to watch a boy who had a YouTube channel named Evan HD. I've put a link to YouTube if you want to look at that later. And Evan unwraps various sets of Lego toys in these videos. He didn't make them himself. He's got his parent to put the camera to his face as he then unboxes these Legos. So these are videos. Unboxing videos are videos in which commercial goods are unwrapped, and then they become very popular with the most frequently viewed channels that attract billions of views. And those aimed at children focus on unwrapping of toys or artifacts such as Kinder eggs and so on. While some showcase child presenters such as Evan HD, others feature adults. And these are potentially lucrative business. So there's one unboxing channel by Disney Collector who unlocks surprise Kinder eggs. And it's estimated that she, and it is a she used to be a hairdresser, and she's now accruing between $2 and $13 million a year in advertising revenue. So on the surface, the viewing of these unboxing videos may appear to be a straightforward consumerist practice that's focused on the desire for goods, a form of vicarious consumption. But observing and talking to Gareth and his mum, I felt that there was much more to it than that. So in the paper that I sent a link to, I've suggested that we might see this practice as participation in an affinity group, where the child is constructed as a cyber flaneur, drawing on the concept of flaneur that Baudelaire developed. So in the 19th century, the flaneur was someone who strolled the streets of 19th century Paris, enjoying the sights but not necessarily purchasing goods. So here the children are cyber flaneurs, and lots of people have written about this concept of cyber flaneur. And so it's not a project of vanity. The flaneur in 19th century Paris often wanted to be seen shopping. Here the child is obviously invisible if they don't chat on the YouTube channel. So it's not so much that they are wanting to consume. Gareth's mum talked about him not actually wanting to purchase these goods that he saw being unboxed. It was more about participating in this affinity group with a child who also enjoyed his passions. And I also think there's something aesthetic about these videos as children hear the crinkle of the paper unwrapping and so on. And it might then remind children of their own unwrapping of presents. And so the role of memory and affect could be important. So these are a huge phenomenon in very young children's YouTube use, which I think is of interest. Next slide, please. The other, Gareth also participated in virtual worlds, and I'm not going to talk much about this because I've written a lot about this, as has Karen Walwend and her team. So these are virtual worlds where the child can take on an avatar, and in Club Penguin, the Disney virtual world, the avatar is a penguin, as you can see here. So what's interesting about this phenomena is not so much although it is very interesting what children are doing on online spaces, but I'm also interested in this peer-to-peer cultural production that we can see through the unboxing videos, but also in the development of a whole range of artifacts that link to their affinity groups. So, for example, I've also been studying Club Penguin machinima. Machinima is a conflation of the term machine and cinema. And so they're films made in virtual worlds and computer games using screen capture software. So, I mean, children have always produced text for other children, so we know it was a well-documented feature of the Brontes' childhood, for example. But now the online world enables this peer-to-peer sharing of text to be more global and instantaneous in nature. So these Club Penguin music video producers, CPMV, they vie to be the first one to release the latest song here, the Let It Go, the Frozen song. And so we saw a number of those releases that was linked to the film. And so those productions are an example of children's creative digital activities with music. They might make videos with soundtracks and upload films of themselves, or they may create and circulate ringtones and so on. Small uses the term music king to characterize people's everyday engagement with music. And so I think we can see these social networking practices, we can characterize them as vernacular digital music king of young children. Of course, moving on to the next slide, the ladder of opportunity, we can't assume that all children are uploading and creating their own videos. So here, drawing on the work of Sonia Livingston and her team in the EU Kids Online study, you can see that they developed what they call a ladder of opportunities, which show how progressively fewer children are engaging in some of the more, we might see it as productive uses of the internet. So whilst 100% of children who are online play games and do schoolwork, as they move up the ladder, we find fewer children, 86% of children, for example, watching video clips online, 75% of children using social networking, 56% of children playing in virtual worlds with others and so on, and then just 23% of children being sort of music producers, digital music producers, as we saw with CPMV. And that's a figure that's even lower, I think, with the children under 8. So certainly in the school that I showed you, the online-offline map, we found only 10% of the children were reporting they were uploading their own films to YouTube. So one of the things I think about digital access and equity is allowing all children to develop these kinds of productive skills, which are going to be so important for the future. So it's even more important for early years settings to be helping children to be able to develop these skills. So if we move on then to the next slide, which should have a Skype and a child on a smartphone. You can see that. So I just want to talk briefly about the changes, that discontinuities that I've seen in children's communicative practices with families. So 10 years ago in the Digital Beginnings study, a few of the families did discuss using Skype to contact distant family members, particularly the immigrant families who used Skype to contact their parents back home, so diasporic uses of Skype. But in the European study of 70 families that we've recently completed, obviously Skype was still used, but also alongside FaceTime, and the mobility of the smartphones meant that children were able to, engage in communication with their families instantaneously often. And often play and games would be part of this, so children playing hide and seek and so on, as they engaged in communication at a distance with their families. So moving on to Facebook, we also found, quite surprisingly, that in the school that I'm focusing on, we asked 77 5 to 8-year-olds if they had their own Facebook page, and almost a third of them did, which was surprising because, as you know, only children and people aged 13 above are supposedly meant to go on Facebook, although we know that children from 9 onwards go on it. But when I talked to children about what they were doing on Facebook, it seemed heavily mediated by parents. Parents had set up the Facebook pages, and they were often used to join in with, if you can move on to the next slide, please, They were often used to have the child join in with some of the virtual world games that you can find on Facebook, such as Farmville. Also, children were using it to look at photographs of family members and so on. I think there's a lot of work to be done with parents here, because I do feel that for some parents, they perhaps didn't understand the way in which children could be targeted through the online gambling sites in these social network spaces. But nevertheless, I don't think we should need to close down. Parents were really genuinely wanting their children to be part of their family digital literacy practices in using these sites. And then finally, what we saw in the EU project, if you go on to the next slide, please. Tablets are playing their part in increased interactions between family members. So children able to cluster around tablets and collaborative play. So this is one family I interviewed, for example. All 4 siblings collaboratively played Minecraft. They each have their own island. Sometimes they played it on their own and sometimes collaboratively. And it fitted around their daily family timetable. So if we move to the next slide, please. As Emmy Vold has said, then, play in this way is domesticated in the double sense of the word. So it's brought into the home, but also subordinated and subjected to the norms of the family in the home. So I'm just going to close now by thinking about the future. So if we've looked at the changes in children's practices over time, what can we anticipate in the next few years? Inevitably, as we look to the future, we also see that some of these things are happening already. So I think due to GPS technologies, we can see probably more active use of some of the apps such as Hidden Park. I don't know if you've come across this, but this is where you can, using QR codes, develop an adventure in your own local park that you then use on a smartphone to access. So if someone's been there before it, other family stories come up in your smartphone. This kind of thing is also being used now in Canada. So those of you from Canada may be familiar with the next slide, story mobs. So whereas we've seen flash mobs used for entertainment and political purposes, they're increasingly used in children's worlds. So here, a group known as story mobs put on interactive story performances for children based on picture books, in this case, Where the Wild Things Are, that are then promoted through social media. And then, so they turn up in the local park and through social media advertise it and the families turn up. And I think we'll see those kinds of initiatives becoming more widespread as families do embed social media into their lives, particularly in some countries. I realise in other countries where mobile access, is not as extensive, or internet access not as easy, we won't see these in the next few years. If we look at the next slide also, we're also seeing wearable technologies as part of children's culture. We saw them in Pixie Hollow, which is closed now, hasn't it, the Disney online virtual world, and children could purchase clickable bracelets and then they could exchange virtual world currency and goods with their friends. So, and here we can see interactive pajamas that you can use your smartphone and choose a story that can be played on your smartphone. So we're obviously in the early days of wearable technologies. We're seeing Google Glasses come and go, but I think it's an interesting area that we see embedded into children's play in a range of ways in the years ahead. And then, of course, 3D printers as they become more accessible. So at the moment, they're very expensive. Here are Make-It. You can design a doll and print it out in the UK at Selfridges, but they're over £100. If you move to the next slide, please. This is another company where you can send in your child's drawing and they'll print it out as a 3D artifact. But as 3D printers reduce in price, I think we'll be able to see these technologies embedded in children's play online in a range of imaginative ways. And no doubt, I'm sure Lego will be there, so they'll be able to, develop a product, a model online, and then print it off. And then finally, I know Sherry Turkle has warned us of this in her book Alone Together, but we can see, increasing use of robots, and I think we'll see these becoming more sophisticated in children's play, and that has, a very interesting potential. This was a robot that was sent up with an astronaut and had been programmed to interact with the astronaut, and we can already see it through some of the dolls. Which are programmed, to give children responses when they're trying to find information and so on. I found Sherry Turkle's book a little bit over-negative for me, and she talked about the way in which this might isolate us all in our own particular world. so that we just become interactive with robots, but I think children will incorporate them in their play as they normally do. All these new technologies become naturalized and embedded into play. Well, not all. We know that some are rejected and never adopted. And then finally, I think augmented reality, as Lego Fusion showed, it shows a lot of promise for children's play, but it is a bit limited in feature at the moment. So here we see an app where children can draw a sea creature, upload it to an aquarium through the use of the app, and then they can see their sea creatures floating about in the aquarium. And that's all it can do at the moment, but very soon I think these kinds of apps will be able to incorporate storytelling and story capture features. So if we move to the concluding slide then, I'd just like to sort of quickly summarize my key points really, which is that we can see the continuities about the way in which technologies are very much embedded in family life. Gaming stayed popular over time, and obviously children's creativity and innovation never changes. But discontinuities, I think we can now see the extent of children's socialization and participation and mobilization in many families. We still have that digital divide, and we do need to attend to that. We've seen increasingly complex online-offline interface, and I think we've seen a growth of this peer-to-peer creative industry. So I think in the future we're going to need new theoretical tools for understanding online-offline relationships, and also the role of affect, as we can see with these unboxing videos. Definitely the role of affect and memory has a key part to play there. And so I think we need to think about that in relation to digital personalization. And then obviously methodological challenges as we trace practices across space and time. We're beginning to use chest cams and head cams in some of our families' work, but even that doesn't get some of the complexities that children are doing across the day. And then finally, I think there's a need for academic and media industry partnerships, so that we can develop digital artifacts that are appropriate for the needs. So I've just started an ESRC funded project funded by our government, in which we're working with CBeebies and some media producers looking at children's engagement with apps and how they promote play and creativity. So it'd be interesting to see if through that partnership we can develop a greater understanding of the kinds of developments that are needed in apps in the future. And I'll just close with the final slide. We're thinking about the future. I don't feel that any of us can address some of these questions on our own. It's got to be through networks and collaborations. And so in April, we're launching a European network of researchers across 25 European countries, focused on digital literacy and multimodal practices of young children. So there are 25 countries involved. It's going to last 4 years, and we're going to have a series of seminars and events where we can bring researchers together and to explore some of these areas. So if any of you are interested in keeping in contact with this network, do let me know, and I'll keep you up to date with developments, and you're welcome to attend events and so on. So I'll stop there to give us time for discussion, and I'll get my glasses on and go back over some of the questions. And thank you so much for listening, and I apologize for the fact that you didn't have the slides for the beginning of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marsh. That was an incredible talk, and it certainly generated a number of very interesting questions for sure. One of the questions from our audience members asks, do you see a shift in gender identity, or are there traditional gender roles that are now shifted as a result of digital play? Do children, boys and girls, play with girls and boys in the same way, or have you noticed anything in terms of gender?
Yeah, that's such an interesting area. I have noted with our when we looked at young children's online friendships, we did notice that, so we did a study, it was a few years ago now, I think we finished it in 2011. We spent 2 years looking at children's play in playgrounds and then traced their friendships online as well. And we found that in the playgrounds, unfortunately, there was still a lot of stereotypical gender play, so girls would cluster with girls in general, not all, we can't generalize. And there were certainly different interests, so girls very often interested in replaying some of the pop songs and so on that they'd heard on the radio. Boys more interested in playing some of the computer war games in particular were popular. So Call of Duty, for example. There were children who did not subscribe to those gender stereotypes, but they were few and far between. But when we saw on the online spaces, we saw children more willing. The older children were more willing to play with their gendered identities online, so more willing to adopt an avatar of a different gender. Whereas the younger children, stereotypically, chose avatars that were the same gender as themselves. So we did see a little bit more freedom online, which was really interesting. I don't know what will happen in the future as this online-offline blurring. I think we'll see children being challenged to adopt different identities across those spaces and having that potential and opportunity. So for me, I think that online-offline crossover is a productive space, and it certainly means that those kind of peer-to-peer practices which close down children's gendered play, not so prevalent. That's not to say it isn't prevalent online, because it is through the chat forums and so on. Children are often very careful to say, well, that's girls' space, that's boys' space, and so on. But because they've got that anonymity online, girls and boys, more willing to explore those gendered identities. And I know that's certainly true for older children. There's been some research in America around, actually I can't remember the name of the virtual world, but they've shown with older children very much more willing to play about with gendered identities.
Thank you. We have another question that's a tad bit similar, and one of our audience members asks, several years ago I used your one-way traffic research to similarly look at classroom and home literacies. Do you see classroom evidence of children's cultures? Also, this audience member is interested to know how interested in this aspect of children's lives are teachers generally, and in particular children who struggle with literacy.
Yeah, that's another interesting area. I've definitely seen changes over the years, I'm pleased to say. So that when I first began this work looking at children's popular culture interests, I began actually as a master's student and set up a Batwoman role play area and looked at how children responded. And I remember going to conferences to talk about this, and teachers being quite shocked that we would want to introduce superhero play. And then of course you've had the work of Anne Dyson in the UK. She's looked extensively at this, long before the rest of us were. So because I think we've got that long-standing tradition in relation to superhero play, we certainly see that much more accepted in classrooms. What we don't see is the acceptance so much of children's digital practices, so their use of computer games, the use of virtual worlds, and so on. For many teachers, these are practices that they might not be familiar with, and certainly there's a concern that children are spending a lot of time digitally outside of school, and therefore if they incorporate these into the classrooms, parents might be critical, and so on. So there are pockets of fantastic practice. So we've got teachers using Minecraft in the classroom productively, all kinds of computer games, as the way Catherine Beavis in Australia has shown. It's teachers are growing in this area. But I would say for children in the early years, we still see some antipathy, I would say, towards children's use of virtual worlds, and through the watching things like unboxing videos. So, a lot of criticism that this is just about children's commercial cultures and their position as commercial agents in the world, rather than thinking it through in terms of affinity groups. So I do think we've moved a long way from when I wrote that paper, One-Way Traffic. There was very little incorporation of children's culture in the classroom then, but I'm pleased to say, we see that superhero play now very much embedded in many early years settings. But we've still some way to go. But I wouldn't be critical of teachers in this. They've got a lot of pressures on their time with policy changes and so on. So I think it's a matter of doing the work that people like Vivian Vasquez does, and yourself, Peggy, where we get teachers researching alongside and looking at their own practice in a critical manner, and seeing that actually you can meet the standards by incorporating children's cultural practices in the classroom.
Thank you, Jackie. We have another question, of course. There's the question of access, and I know you mentioned something a little bit early, but could you talk a little bit more about how do we handle the equity issues, one of our audience members writes. It seems like it could be limiting in a space that doesn't have access. Any recommendations for somebody in an access issue environment?
Sorry, I didn't hear that last sentence. What was that, Peggy?
The last sentence was, any recommendations for someone in an access issue environment?
Oh, right.
A space that doesn't have much access?
Yes, yeah. No, I think that's a very important question. And certainly we're seeing that in relation to the phenomenal growth and interest in tablets in the UK, where we're seeing use double in some socio-economic groups, and yet other young children not getting access to those. And so I think that's where it's even more important for early years settings and schools to acquire some of these technologies and to set up home loan schemes if that's possible, where children could take home the technologies. And also, it doesn't have to be, high tech. I think, you were saying earlier, just a digital camera, being able to go and take photographs of, your local environment, bring that back, make a slideshow from it. Some of those low technologies can be very productive in terms of what you can do with them. Most families now, I don't know what the international figures are, but I know it's growing, use mobile phones and smartphones. And so there are lots of things that you can do with those in terms of capturing photographs and audio. So I think using some of those technologies that, are embedded within the communities in productive ways can help, as well as schools trying to invest in a small number of tablets, even if they are the cheaper Android tablets. So in the UK, we've got one of our major supermarkets, Tesco's, have produced something called a Huddle, which is it's about $200 to buy one of these, much cheaper than some of the other tablets. And yes, it doesn't have the affordances of some of the like the iPad, but it does allow children to do a whole range of things. And so, letting parents borrow these, take them home for a week or so, and play with them with children is important. But I do know, I think that unless schools and nurseries recognise their role in that, we're only going to see that digital divide be exacerbated in the years ahead.
That leads kind of nicely into this next question, Jackie. One of our audience members writes, is it possible for schools to catch up or stay alongside children who enter school with all of this digital knowledge, and especially in schools where many of these games and digital worlds are behind firewalls?
Yes, I think that's a very good question. And I don't have the answer to that. I have to say, my research hasn't traced children longitudinally. I have an instinct about it, which, we know that from all of the research with reading, that those children who get access to books at home and so on end up reading much more than, other children who don't, and different types of text, which gives them different access then to academic literacies. So I can only anticipate that digital divide, might grow. And certainly if we see the kinds of practices that, I've done some work on the children who produce these Club Penguin machinima, and they do tend to be the children who have quite a privileged access to technology at home. They've already had the sort of the machinima, I can't remember the name of the software, the screen capture software, but they'll have had it embedded in their computers for many years, whereas other children have to wait until it's embedded into the latest Xbox, and so on. So they're already quite ahead in developing a whole range of skills. So I do think that it's very hard for children to catch up, but nevertheless, I don't think, technology is always going to change, isn't it? And it's not that we can future-proof every child, but if we can give them a set of skills that are about problem solving and critical engagement and reflexivity, they're important, I think. And by giving them those kinds of skills, then we can make sure that they have a more equal access. I think the whole issue of firewalls is very important. In one of the schools that I've worked in, we did some work on virtual worlds, and the teacher really wanted the children to develop their affinity groups and create machinima so they'd be able to, develop those skills that other children were demonstrating outside of school. But then the firewall closed it down. So, unless some of the local authorities, school authorities, really take this issue seriously, then again, we are actually, making sure that children don't have equal access. So I think that's an excellent point. So, yeah, I don't know. It's a very important question whether children ever catch up. But I think, rather than sort of worrying about that, I think if we just make sure that our agenda is to give children a basic platform of key skills, which are obviously about technological skills, but to me are much more about critical engagement, critical thinking, and reflexivity.
Well, we have time for one more question, unfortunately, but this question is from some of our researcher audience members, and they ask, what Jackie is, sorry, I lost my question. I'm sorry about that. What data analysis methods are good for those researchers, young researchers especially, who are attending tonight? If they want to study digital practices, what do you recommend? How could they, what analysis tools?
Well, a whole range of tools, obviously, are relevant for different questions. My approach to data analysis is still quite traditional in the sense that, I use thematic analysis through questioning children and observing. But there are a whole range of things that you can do with data. So Yasmin Cafe, she's been doing some work in the US around Yville. And there's been some very interesting work on analysing data logging, looking at what children are doing and when, and clustering their networks and so on through the use of software. So I think there's a whole range of ways in which we can track children's online activities in ways that I haven't. As I say, my approach has been quite traditional, ethnographic, observing closely and listening closely, and then using critical discourse analysis, for example, in examining what teachers are saying, what children are saying, and so on. I think also there's some interesting developments in multimodal analysis. So Julia Bishop, the researcher that I worked alongside on the Playgrounds project, did some really fascinating multimodal analysis of children's clapping games, so that she was able to trace in very close detail how children were passing on the rhyme and rhythms of clapping games, not so much orally, but through nuances in body language, hand movements, and so on. So I think, the work that's in London, Kerry Jewett's work and so on, in terms of looking at how we might break the modes down, looking at clusters of modes and how those modes interact, are very important. So they're the key ones that I would use, but I do think that we do have challenges in this area, particularly tracing children's practices as they move across online and offline spaces. And so for me, it's the approaches to data analysis. They need to be linked very clearly to the kinds of theories that can help us, unpack some of that. So I'm thinking of the work of Kathy Burnett and colleagues, where they talk about this notion of immateriality. We have to think about what's material and what's immaterial as we trace practices across online and offline. So these are very interesting areas that I'm hoping this COS network, we can engage in some of this discussion in the years ahead. So please join in that network and engage in that conversation with us.
I think that's just great, Jackie. We haven't any more time for any questions, unfortunately. Your talk was very inspiring, and we really appreciate your response to the audience questions. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Boylan, our host.
Dr. Jackie Marsh is a professor of education at the University of Sheffield in England. Dr. Marsh's research focused on the relationship between childhood cultures, play, and literacy in the digital age. She explores children's access to new technologies and their emergent digital literacy skills, knowledge, and understanding, and the way in which parents, carers, and other family members support this engagement with media and technologies. In her more recent research, Dr. Marsh has explored changes in children's play due to developments in media, technology, and commercial cultures. She is the author of a number of books that address young children, play, and digital literacy, including Changing Play, Play, Media, and Commercial Culture from the 1950s to the present day, Children's Virtual Play Worlds, Culture, Learning, and Participation, and Children, Media, and Playground Cultures, Ethnographic Studies and of School Playtime. Tonight's seminar draws on data from a number of studies of young children's aged birth to 8 literacy lives in the United Kingdom in order to consider the nature of their online literacy practices over the past decade and to examine some of their current practices. At this time, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jackie Marsh and her presentation entitled Young Children's Online Practices, Past, Present, and Future.
Hi. Okay, so can you hear me okay, yeah? So thank you very much for inviting me. I'd like to thank Peggy very much for inviting me to present to you today, and I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to participate. I will explain. I'm on a very small laptop, so I'll have to put my glasses on later to see what you're writing in the chat forum. So what I want to do today is reflect on the changing nature of young children's online practices as we move ever more steadily into the digital age. And I want to contrast children's play, literacy, and media practices in the past. I want to go a little bit past the beginning use of the internet to the 1950s, because that relates to some recent work that I've done. But then look over the past decade in particular to children's early years in internet use, and then thinking about the online practices that children today are engaged. And then at the end of the presentation, just want to look ahead to think about what some of the challenges that might face those of us who are trying to understand this area. What will those challenges be for us? So that's the aim of the presentation. So if I move on to the next slide.
Yeah, just hit that little right button there, Jackie. There.
Oh yes, there.
It's just right.
Okay. Yes, there you go. Sorry. Okay, so it's a little unusual in that I am drawing on a number of studies and not just one study. So forgive me if it's, there's breadth rather than depth, but I just wanted to take this overview. And I'm going back to a study that I did in 2005 now, a national study of over 1,800 families, children aged 0 to 6 in the UK, called the Digital Beginning Study. I'm also going to draw on a paper that I've recently written, looking at the audience reception to the Disney film, Davy Crockett, which was released in the 1950s, and contrast that with the audience reception to Frozen, which was released very recently. And that draws on some secondary data from the corpus material of Iona and Peter Opie, who were folklorists in the UK. So then moving on to the present, I'm going to draw from a recent study. We've only just published this report, and I was a member of the UK team along with Sonia Livingston and Lydia Plowman in England, and we looked at 10.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining tonight's web seminar featuring Dr. Jackie Marsh. It is nice to see returning GCLR participants, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. We hope you will continue participating in future web seminars. Your moderators for this evening are Dr. Peggy Albers, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia, USA, and me, Ryan Boylan, Language and Literacy doctoral student at Georgia State University. We also have a research team of doctoral students from Georgia State University and a doctoral student from the University of Pennsylvania. Global Conversations in Literacy Research consists of online interactive web seminars with the intent to circulate cutting-edge research in the fields of literacy and language arts. GCLR, as a research project, seeks volunteers for our study of critical literacy professional development in online spaces. If you are willing to participate in a brief interview, please type your email address into the chat area and a research team member will contact you within a few days to schedule an appointment. We also invite you to take our survey. The hyperlink is located on the GCLR website. The data collected will provide important information for understanding our research regarding web seminars and their impact on international literacy discussions. During tonight's web seminar, if you have any comments or questions, please type them into the chat box, and Dr. Marsh will address these at the end of her presentation. We would love to know from where you are participating in tonight's web seminar, so please use the star tool located to the immediate left of this slide and click your location on the map.
Families and young children aged 6 and 7, their use of a range of digital technologies. And that was 6 countries plus Russia, so very interesting to look at the similarities across European children's use of technologies. And then I also want to draw on a recent case study of a young boy starting school in England. This is part of Anhar Dyson is developing a book where we all, across I think 6 or 7 countries, we have to contribute a case study of a young child starting school from our different countries. And so I chose Gareth, who was 4.5, and I traced his online practices from home to school over the course of 3 months. So I'll talk a little bit about Gareth because I think what he's doing is very interesting in relation to some of the new phenomena that we're seeing young children engage in, certainly within the UK. And then finally, I want to talk about a project that's going to begin in April 2015 that I want to invite you all to participate in if you wish to. So I'm going to look across all of these projects and try and bring out some of the key themes that informs this historical analysis of children's online practices. So I have posted the links, I've given Peggy the links to all of the papers, which are all online and accessible if you want to follow up afterwards. So I'm not going to talk in great detail about the theoretical background to these studies that is embedded in the papers, but obviously I draw on new literacy studies because first and foremost that identifies the way in which literacy is a social practice. Then also I draw on work emerging from the field of new literacies such as Lancashire and Noble's work, and then more recent work in that field that has drawn on the term digital literacies, which obviously refers to digital meaning making, reading, writing, multimodal authoring on screens of all kinds. And then drawing on a theory of multimodality to look at the range of modes and media young children are engaged in. Obviously also draw on the work of a range of people, James and so on, in childhood cultures, but in the more recent studies looking at child law, so that is the childhood practices that are transmitted orally and multimodally in playgrounds and streets. So that's been informing some of my recent work thinking about the continuities and discontinuities in play and literacy over time. And then finally, cultural and material studies and media studies are also important in understanding this relationship of children's practices across a range of media. And in particular, the work of Raymond Williams, who talks about the way in which culture is ordinary. And that's been a key theme of my work right from the beginning, that we need to attend to the ordinary popular cultural interests of children because that's where a lot of our knowledge lies around children's competences across a range of media. So sorry, let me just move on. So I want to start with thinking about the past. From the Digital Beginning study, which was 10 years ago now in the UK, less than a third of children were accessing the internet at that point, and they were mainly doing it alongside their adult carers. children were demonstrating independence in the use of access at that time. So, for example, parents would say things like, well, you know, my child can't read, but he can actually shut down everything competently. Children could go on to the web browser and locate favorite programs by recognizing the relevant logos, so their logographic knowledge was helping them to navigate the internet. And the kinds of practices that they engaged in were primarily related to gaming, particularly oriented to their interests in television, CBeebies, Nickelodeon, and so on, and their popular cultural interests. And as you can see there, very few children participating in communication through emails or mobile phones. So this could be seen as a, you know, very early days of internet use for this age group. I don't have the figures here for you know, international figures, but I know from the work of Rideout and so on, we can see this similar pattern in the US. So they were the early days. Moving on to the sort of